Tomaž, thank you very much to be a part of Sarajevo Fest. This year, it's my great pleasure. And thank you for that. We will talk today about the influence of technology on politics and ideology and society in today's world. And I read an interesting search made by a US mobile technology company. They concluded that 10% of US citizens are checking their mobile phones during sex. And it was a little bit scary for me, but I wasn't surprised. So what kind of world is that we live in now?
Yeah. So the first question is the quality of sex that those people who have to check on the phones. I don't know. I mean, it's really scary how this is penetrating all aspects of our life. And as as the example you picked up shows, it's really going deep into intimate life as well. It's not just the question of how we walk on the street and make suspicious gestures and things like that, but it's really taking over the way we live. It's everywhere, and we getting lost. So as these technologies are everywhere, our life is slowly dissipating.
And how we can save our privacy, our freedom, our dignity in a world where everything is digitalized, but not only digitalized, but we are surveilled by these, not even human beings, but we are surveilled by these algorithms, by these artificial intelligence, and they know everything about us. The robots, the computers know everything about us. So
how do we get out of? How do we?
No, can we preserve our freedom in such system?
Well, it would take a fight. You know, if we look at the logic of the developments, if you look at how these things are developing, then the conclusion. I mean, if we let the process continue, we will be subjected to this new kind of rule, and we are going to lose freedom and privacy and dignity. I mean, I have no doubts about that. The question is, why is this happening, and how to understand this kind of control? And as I think about it, I think that what we are witnessing now is a change in the mode of control and subjection of the underlying population of the propertyless classes of society. Because in the, I mean, if we generalize, we may say that we lived for about 2 centuries in industrial society. The basic characteristic of that society was the subjugation of labor to capital, and subjugation of the subjugation of labor to capital was the new historical form of subjugation of the propertyless classes by those who have the property. And this kind of control and subjection was tied to the labor process. It was tied to labor, to organization of labor, and so on. And since industry has permeated the whole society was determined by this kind of control and subjugation, labor and labor capital. And what we are witnessing now is a situation in which we are entering a new phase of capitalist, let's call it capitalist society, in which control is no longer tied to industrial labor. And societies are deindustrializing, especially in the West. In the United States, all the industry was exported to the places with cheap labor. There was a big deindustrialization in England, for example. The last big labor struggles in Britain were ended by closing up industry in the 80s, in the 1980s. And also in other European countries, we have the process of deindustrialization going on. This is linked to the financialization of the economy of the advanced Western economies, and is the financial capital that is now being used that now has the hegemonic role. And part of the new control was financialization of our lives, by putting people in debt, by producing this so-called financial literacy and so on. But with this financialization and deindustrialization means that the old means of control and subjection, which used to be linked to industrial labor, to the labor process, are obsolete. And capital, which still exists, needs to invent new forms of control and subjection. And this is a process that started somewhere in the 1970s with the crisis of capitalism and with the rise of
liberalism.
Yeah. And what happened there was that the first big step was that the let's say, classical opposition politics, which was in the last instance class politics, and which was in the world on the world scene anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist. That kind of politics was dissolved into a multitude of identity politics, and those identity politics were then engaged with fighting all kinds of authorities, especially linked to sexual life, to personal life, to lifestyles and so on. And it was fighting so-called micropower.
Mm-hmm.
And this opened a big field for the intervention of capital in our private lives and what we still had of collective life. And collective life was slowly disintegrating. Mm-hmm. And this was the terrain in which this new techniques of individualization entered. Individual was dissolved or designed as a bundle of identities, which were seen as a bundle of information, which was handled by these algorithms in the last, as you said. So we have the slow entry of the digitalization of life, the entry of this technological management of informations which were what the individuals were composed of.
And what can we do, or can we do anything to change that process?
Well, I mean, it's the requirement of capital to insist on introducing these new modes of subjection and control, because that would enable the transition to the so-called green capitalism and so-called sustainable growth and sustainable economy. I mean, this is all propaganda, of course, but in order to make that transition possible, the digitalization of life and the digitalization of control has to continue. Now, if we want to stop that, we have to look to ways of how to exit out of a society that's dominated by capital. So it's a big statement, but we, instead of thinking about that, we are thinking about how to make the existing system a little better, a little more bearable. But it's really about finding an exit out of this capitalist society, or going down that way of digital slavery.
And what's the alternative of the capitalist system?
Well, that's what we have to work on. I mean, we need to identify for almost half a century, the politics on the leftist politics is in decline. And this was the politics that used to think about alternatives. And what prevailed was sort of acceptance of neoliberalism with the formula, there is no alternative. And we now live under the tyranny of the world, in which we, all of us, are starting to believe that there really is no alternative. So we have to, which means that we need to start thinking about alternatives anew. That's a task about what would this mean, and just reorient our thinking in that direction. But if we then ask more concretely, I mean, it's still very abstract and general, what to do, we have to identify where the power lies. So what's the seat of power? And if we look at this situation, we have a sort of symbiosis between big private economic power and political power. And economic power, this excessive economic power, is in control of the government. Mm-hmm. That's the force that is shaping governmental policies. So the first target should be this excessive economic power. The unbridled economic power should be taken down. We should be deconstructed. Mm-hmm. We need to put limits to this excessive economic power, mm-hmm. because only that will then help us also take back control of political power. So that's the direction in which we should think. And if you look at the history of socialism, and especially history of liberalism, we see that economic power is the blind spot of these prevailing ideologies. Liberalism is all about protecting the individual from the government, from the state power. And socialism, in not in all of its versions, but in most of them, would follow the same path. So it didn't problematize economic power. It was just change the the management. So instead of capitalist management, we will have socialist management, but the economic power was not put under control. To the contrary, socialism was built on the productivist basis, which required economic growth and which also requires that, it required, but it made possible the excessive growth of economic power. So we are now in a situation in which we, it's high time to realize that it's economic power, an excessive economic power, uncontrolled economic power, that is as dangerous and destructive as unrestrained political power.
And when we are talking about the alternatives, how see you that situation that we saw an alternative in the populist right, who is rising in the world? Trump, as some kind of the American version of the populist right, was elected the president of the United States. We have politicians like Viktor Orban. We have politicians like your Slovenian Prime Minister Janez Janša, who have that concept, okay, we are against the globalization, we are against liberalism, we also against neoliberalism, but we are advocating for a strong nation state and for securing national interests. And my question is, why do you think that the alternative to the leading liberal system in the world came in populist right, and the populist right is at that moment much more popular than any kind of more radical or maybe even populist left? Why we don't have mainstream strong left-wing populist parties in the world, and we have strong populist right-wing parties?
Look, there is. It's a great question, and it has a number of layers. One is, why is the so-called right-wing populism more popular than any other politics? Because it is, let's face the truth, it is the only oppositional politics. It's or is the most serious oppositional politics, the only politics that is at least on the declarative level opposing neoliberalism. The other question is, why do we have right-wing populism and not left-wing populism, or why the left-wing populism, as far as it exists, is so much weaker? It's because the left had collapsed.
Why?
The left, that's another question. Let's decide a little bit.
One by one.
But you cited Orban and Janša and Trump, and say that they are for national sovereignty and against globalization and against neoliberalism. That's not true. It's not the case.
But they are telling that.
They are telling that. They are telling that because that's the way. That's demagogy. That's demagoguery. That's the way to capture the dissatisfaction and the hatred even of the majority of the population with the political establishment. But if you look at the politics, Janša is not a nationalist. He's not working for the national interest. He's a neoliberal. He is complying with all the measures from EU and from the US that are curtailing national sovereignty. But there is a segment of this politics that is sort of socially conservative. Orban is also, Orban is a more complicated case because he has a stronger social politics. There is stronger social dimension to his politics. He also tried to keep some control over the central bank or the finances. But when it comes to labor, to free market, to competition, he is a rabid neoliberal. And all these people, Orban and Janša and the Poles, Kaczynskis and others, are supporting the forces that are the drivers of the existing neoliberal system. They are pro-US, pro-Israel, pro-NATO. They are supporting the forces that are actually whose politics is directly opposed to looking for alternatives to neoliberalism, and that is trying to reconstruct some of the national sovereignty. And in some sense, they are globalist. They're talking about, I mean, not Yansha, but maybe there are aspects of that in the US with the Trump administration. They are talking about sort of protecting national economy, but in the crucial aspect of our today economic life, they are supporting the wars of aggression in the Middle East, in the Far East, in Africa, in Latin America, which are supporting the existing neoliberal system. And neoliberalism cannot exist without those imperialist wars. And these so-called right-wing populist politicians are all supporting that.
The second question was, why the left collapsed?
Why the left collapsed? You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't have, or let's put it this way, I don't have a simple question. A simple answer. It's I would trace the decline of the left to the student movement and to the of the 1960s, and that was a turn. That was a time where the left ceased to be anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist. That was a time when it began to take to part with the working class, and it began to look for other options. That's what I mentioned before. All those struggles against the micropower and things like that. It was part of the reason was that capital was more successful in reorganizing itself than the opposition to capital was. There were big shifts, especially with the decoupling of U.S. dollar from the gold standard, which is the basis of the financial domination of the U.S. today, and that's again the linchpin of the financial domination of our economies. So that was a big step in the reorganization of the capital, and the left was slow to react. Then there were limitation and blind spots to what was the prevailing left ideology, which was based in Marxism. It's a great body of thought, and it's history that calls for recognition, but there were limitations to what we could do in the classical framework of that thought. Then there was another factor was the Soviet Union, which was in decline, with a completely rigid political verkhushka, the political leadership. And there was a very successful spread of the American soft power. I mean, the penetration and of American culture to all aspects of our life, which again shifted our attention away from the questions, from the issues which we should have dealt with in order to revive or keep the left alive. There were wars, like, the US was out of the Vietnam War, and it responded with the reorganization of capital in the global relationship, while the Soviet Union was fell into the trap of the occupation of Afghanistan, which was a difficult proposition for the left to defend.
Mm-hmm.
There was the rise of Israel and Israeli influence on world politics, and some of the aspects of Israeli politics was the sanctification of Holocaust, a discussion about Holocaust in Europe, which was the first time that legal limits were put on what is allowed to discuss and what not. This was then, the precedent that, that would lead so many decades later to hate speech and to other invented ideas about how to limit and curtail the freedom of speech, and which also means curtailing the freedom of thought. And okay. It's a big story. I mean, we could talk. We can
write thousands of books about why the left collapsed. Yeah. I think, but let's get a little bit to technology and, to be more precise, to social networks. So, with the development of the internet and with the development of the social networks, many were thinking and many were considering that we will get more information, we will be more educated, and the thing that you can use the social networks, every citizen can use the social networks to write what he will, to express his mind. Many thought that will lead us to more democratic society. The government, the elites, the people who have power will have more direct communication with the citizens. But I think, on the contrary, it happens something different in practice. I think, in my opinion, to some degree, that people getting more misinformed, people are reading less, not reading more. And they have less information, not more, because people now are thinking just, okay, I have all the answers on Google and I don't need to read anything or try to find informations that I will know about anything on the one hand. But on the other hand, I think not that we have become more democratized, but I think some elites and some forces, some interest groups are using that social networks to manipulate the opinion of the people, even to the more extent than it was the case with the traditional media. That's my opinion. How do you see that?
Yeah, I agree with you. And again, there is a number of aspects of this issue. And where shall I start? One is that these social networks are in control of big corporations. And these corporations act in what I would call private-public collaboration with the power. It's not, if you look at the state, it's not only Facebook and Google who is censoring the public debate, but it's all done with we in connection with intelligence services, with home security, and with the government, with the State Department, and so on. So this is private-public partnership in which the corporations are the executive hand of the censorship. And this is very convenient for the government because they can wash their hands and they don't interfere with with the freedom of thought and communication. But in fact, they do. It's only, and there are, as long as we insist on the freedom on the free market and free competition, we have no right to interfere with what the corporations are doing. They are acting within their right as the owners of the corporations. They can do whatever they want. So one of the problems is the monopoly of these communicative networks or the social networks. The other aspect is that the social networks, the way they developed, are actually isolating individuals, people who are participating in the network. Everyone is on his or her own. There are no face-to-face contacts. There is no collective work. But we are there as so many individuals who are liking or disliking what's out there, and so it's a situation in which society is dissolving. The social networks are, ironically or paradoxically, a means for dissolving society and social life into individual communications. Then there is the issue of information itself. Your information itself is seen as a value. So all we need is information. But what's, to my mind, much more important is that we know what we want to do with our lives, not only as individuals, but as a collective, as a society. We need to have some goals as a society, as a political community, and we need to think about the ways to achieve those goals as individuals, but also as the members of the political community or society. And that is missing. We only have information, but we don't have ideas about, what we want to do and what's just, what's not just, what's good, what's not good, what's evil. We don't have the basic intellectual, if you want, even spiritual and moral, ethical coordinates. And then all the informations in the world are not going to help us. We are seeing a decline in education. In the West, it's much more pronounced and advanced than in our part of the world, but I'm afraid we are on the same path. And the people are less and less educated. People know less and less, and they don't know how to think. And instead of thinking, they're collecting informations with which they don't know what to do, and they can be easily manipulated.
And you told me that we need an alternative to capitalism. But I think in today's world, we see two models of capitalism who are taking the lead. The one model is, conditionally speaking, the American model of liberal capitalism. And on the other hand, we have a Chinese model of state-controlled capitalism under the rule of the autocratic regime. So who will win in this fight? Or are we going maybe to have a third way?
We may have a third way or a third world war, you know.
Yeah.
But you know, let's first make it clear: the liberal system in the West is authoritarian.
Why?
The way it's functioning now, it's authoritarian because it is all the power is concentrated in very few hands of great economic, private economic power and political power. The power is completely alienated and unaccountable to the population, and there are no political means in place that would allow the majority of the population to control, to have the same politics and to control what the government and the corporations are doing. And this authoritarianism is escalating with the digitalization of control, with the censorship of the social media, with police brutality all across the Western world against different kind of demonstrations, with the criminalization of political opposition. So this is an authoritarian system as it exists now. It still has, or pretends to have, a liberal ideology, but they are authoritarian. They too are authoritarian. It's probably a different kind of authoritarianism as what we see, for example, in China. The difference being that authoritarianism is a term that is used by de facto authoritarian governments of the West to accuse its competitors and try to delegitimize them by accusing them of authoritarianism. So it's a term that's used to delegitimize the opponent and to deflect that kind of criticism from itself. Now, about China, I know very little about China. I'm not an expert in that at all, but I'm very intrigued by the reforms or the measures taken by Chinese leadership in the last few weeks, which are true measures taken by the Communist Party, but these are measures that are reigning in financial power, especially financial power of foreign investors. These are measures that are aiming at. I mean, that at least is a declared goal, but it's also, if we look at the results of economic developments, those results support that. This is a policy that's aimed at the rising of the living standard of the majority of the population. So it's not political economy or economic policy that is led by private gain, regardless of the social consequences, but it's really taking care of fairer distribution of wealth. Mm-hmm. This is an essential difference between the West and China, and it's interesting to look at responses of some of the leading Western ideologists. They see this, what the Chinese party is doing now, they see this as an attack on economy as such, because it's curbing the private profits, it's controlling investments. But that's exactly what we talked about before. You know, they have an idea they have a strategy of national development and application, and then the policies they are implementing is supposed to lead toward achieving those goals, which is the common good, as opposed to the private gain. So what's going on in China, to my mind, is very interesting. It's a challenge. I don't know how far will they go, how consequent they're going to be. But it is in a way, it could be, or maybe it's just hope, and we are all desperate to find something to give us a little bit of hope. Maybe this is a step toward a third way.
So this is my last question. Where do you see the hope in today's world? Is that an example of hope that, in your opinion, we can see as an alternative of what you think is some kind of neoliberal totalitarianism? Excuse me.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with Europe is that it's working against its own interests. The main countries in Europe are still under American military occupation. They have very limited sovereignty, and they are hostages to American global politics. So, and it's hard to hope for a human-friendly and nature-friendly development in Europe, as long as Europe cannot follow its own interests and not in position to formulate its own economic, social, and other interests. But yes, I mean, the hope would be in looking for directions of economic and other policies that would lead away from neoliberal, completely unsustainable neoliberal model. Unfortunately, EU, as it stands today, with its unelected bodies, the unelected, the governing bodies, is neoliberal political machinery. But that needs to be changed.
Mr. Mastnak, thank you for this great interview.
Thank you for having me.
It was my pleasure.
And
really.
for excellent questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.